pass on the microphone. Good morning. Thank you. First off, thank you, Lee. Where are you? Thank you, Lee. There you are. It's great to be here. Okay. Yes, I am an occupational therapist. I coached gymnastics for about 30 years. No, that's not true. About 40 years. And in doing so, you can hear me? Uh-oh. In doing so, how's that? In doing so, what I learned was a lot of different applications of the art form of gymnastics. First, I am a die-hard, passionate fan of gymnastics. I think it is an art form, not just simply an athletic event. The idea that the human body can do what we ask it to do is spectacular. The art form of gymnastics is, in my appreciation, because as an occupational therapist, I have to view what we do with it differently than what you do. But the art of gymnastics is the art of defying gravity. Gravity is a gigantic motivator as well as manipulator of the human brain. We respond to changes in gravity. As you're sitting there looking at me, your brain is right here on vertical. But as you look down at your page to look, little otoliths in your ear drop down, and all of a sudden your balance is different and you come up. We don't think about it. We just simply do. But every movement we make has a defining response from gravity. Think of what a kid does on tumble track when he's doing round-off back handspring layout. There is so much sensory information hitting that brain in so tight an amount of time that it's quite spectacular. When we see the end of a figure skater's routine where they're spinning, you can hear the buzz, bzzz, and they stop, and then they carry on. Well, one side of your mind is going, my God, how dizzy can you be? But they have rehearsed it so much that they aren't dizzy. They spot, they know what their bodies are doing, and they can move on. That is the rehearsal process. We, as athletes, don't just simply wake up in the morning, maybe unless you're Lance Armstrong, and take a magic pill, and then go out and win, but we have to do it through the rehearsal process. It is work. Either you dig it or you don't. That is the art form of athletics. You work harder to succeed. Okay, to lay the groundwork for what this is going to be just now, first off, I have bad news for all of you. I'm going to be taking volunteers in a few minutes, so worry now. Next, the idea of what we try to do in gymnastics. Let me give you an understanding from my perspective. I was in a gym a couple of years ago, and I was watching a young man who was on the U.S. junior national team, and he was working on a tumble track pass. Very complex, like 10,000 things from start to finish. And he must have done maybe 30 rotations without stopping. Just kept on doing it and doing it and doing it. And I was kind of amazed that he had that diligence. I came up to him afterwards and I said, what are you thinking about while you're doing all of these repetitions? He kind of shrugs and he says, girls. Okay. But what that did do for me is made me recognize that while he's rehearsing these incredibly complex movements, he is not really attending to what he's doing in a detail orientation. He is in what we refer to as active memory. He then says, it's only when something goes wrong that I have to think about what I'm doing. That moment is where his brain flips into working memory. Human beings learn exclusively in working memory. We live our lives in active memory. Active memory is very comfortable. I use the analogy of that's the computer, where you stuff life experiences in, and the computer scaffolds it and gives you use of it as you get older and older. An example of how we go from working memory to active memory here. If you're driving a car, and you're a good driver, you have the radio on, you have someone here, you have someone in the back, and your conversation is going on, and you're still driving safely, and it's on the freeway, and you're under the speed limit, and things are going fine. Then out of nowhere, someone wings in front of you, and you have to slam on the brakes, nearly getting into an accident. Your heart boots. And all of a sudden, you have gone from active memory, and you flipped to working memory. The reason that has to occur is working memory gives you novelty. If it's a new experience for your body, your brain, the brain has no scaffold to say, what do we do here? So you immediately do the only thing you have. You slam on the brakes. That is the only scaffold the brain has under those circumstances. The point also is that you cannot recall what you were talking about 10 seconds before this person gets in front of you. But you can recall that moment where you're slamming on the brakes as if it's moving in slow motion. It's so vivid. Okay, considering that what we do in the gymnastics and in the swim world is intensely sensory. The sensory systems are, as you know, vision, smell, hearing, taste, but there's also several others that are extremely powerful, but they're hidden. Touch. The hand. This part of the hand right here has maybe 5 times the amount of sensory receptors as does this part of your hand. So when we touch things, it gives us an awful lot of information. That's why we can put our hand down and not really think about it. But when we need to move it, your brain goes, move your hand, no problem. That is also called proprioception. Proprioception is one of the best drivers we use as gymnasts, as movement artists. So proprioception informs your brain where the distal parts of your body are at all times. Once it gives you that sense of touch, your brain can go, got it, I don't need to think about it. As you're sitting there on your chairs, your back is against the back of the chair, your brain doesn't remember all the time, it goes, got it, habituates. But when you move, your brain calibrates it and brings you that more detailed information. So it's a constant messing around with your brain. But your brain has been so habituated to this usage from your life that you don't think about it. I deal, as you know, with children with special needs. Those brains do not respond on a predictable basis. So what we have to do with that brain is we have to kind of project. Why is that child doing what that child's doing? And you come up with a sensory-based realization, a motor planning realization, and an organizational realization. All 3 of those components are what we specialize in with Big Fun. The idea of bringing these kids into the professional gymnastic facility wasn't a frivolous idea. I was a gymnast, not to say a great one, but I was into it. And I recognized when I finished my OT degree that the idea of putting a child into a small clinic where the equipment was limited was just wasting time for me. The world is bigger, and I needed to find a bigger pool to play in. So what I did simply is I went to the place where I'm most comfortable, a gymnastic facility, and I started seeing kids. That was about 15 years ago. So far, Big Fun is in about 85 gyms across the United States. We are constantly getting OTs from across the United States to come to me for their level 2 fieldwork. That's a 3-month fieldwork before they become members of the profession. It gets involved, but the idea is that what we do in movement is so precious to the developing body and the developing brain that, as you'll get today and as you've all been witness of these type of presentations, that there's always a learning curve. Let me try and move into the new learning curve. So here is where I warned you, we have a volunteer group. So I'd like volunteers, 1, 2, 3, 4 tables, come on up. Thank you for volunteering. Let's go. That's it, applaud these babies. Now, I'm gonna ask your indulgence, give my volunteers about 2 minutes. Come on up, everybody. Everybody. Ladies, you're up. Come on. Give us a few minutes. Come on in, we gotta huddle up. Oops, excuse me. Let me see if I can get this off. You were screaming. Any questions? Have at it. Take your places, please. Ladies, gentlemen, I call your attention. Okay, are you ready? I need one more volunteer. Thank you. Oh. What is your name? Come on. What is your name? Gilda. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Gilda. Shall we begin? Go. Go. Gilda, come here, please. Face the audience. Now, can you come forward? Okay. What just happened?
We're in chaos.
Chaos. First off, what I wanted to demonstrate is not necessarily a child with special needs, but children coming into an environment that is overwhelming. Visually, a gym is overwhelming. It's big. It's got all this information visually coming at that child's brain, and that child is letting it hit them like a tidal wave. When I brought you up, did you hear anything that I said to you?
Barely.
Did you get that? That was barely. When I asked you to do the movement, were you able to accomplish it?
Not without hitting anybody.
Not without hitting anybody. Okay. If I really started digging into it, again, the difficulty is that you can't hear her, but if I start digging into what just happened, first of all, the overwhelmingness of being that individual doing something different than anybody else. Was it comfortable or uncomfortable?
Very uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable. Right. Okay. I'll let you off the hook. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. A brave soul. All right. The objective there was kind of extreme, but the idea is that kids coming into our environments who have never been in the environment, they are overwhelmed. Now, sensorially, what came at everyone is auditory processing. So much information. Visual processing. So much information. Moving was almost obscure because there was so much information coming at this brain. Is it exclusive to children with special needs that they can be overwhelmed? Hardly. If it happens to children with special needs, why wouldn't it happen to a neurotypical brain? So, what we can do in our environments is recognize that there are culprits that move that child's focus where we don't want it. Noise. The closeness and proximity of others. Those two things alone can really have an impact on your facility. I am always trying to get gyms to recognize that this is a great environment and the kids are there to have fun. Okay, gyms aren't too hard to get that around, but the other side of it is, how do you do that? The idea of fun is a difficult commodity because one person's fun is not another person's. So what we try to do is our jobs. And in doing our job, how do we make that child who can be overwhelmed feel welcome, invited, competent? That again is another jump the track on how we're operating. So there's a lot of information coming at both the professor, the teacher, the child. I'm going to give you some kind of stats. These are like factoids on instruction, teaching, and the effects that the environment can have on that brain. A gentleman in Cornell, upstate New York, was a researcher, and he came up with a whole series of pieces of information which I found at least interesting. So I'm going to give you a couple of these points. Noise. Now, while Gilda was here, amidst all that noise, it was difficult to A, hear what was happening, and B, to respond appropriately. The idea that noises, children's reading, cognitive development, and physiological indicators, and intrinsic motivation, that is that internal drive that makes us do what we wish to do, that intrinsic motivation gets sidetracked. If intrinsic motivation doesn't have its chance to grow, then what happens to that child? Where do they grow into? What is it that we're trying to see that child become if intrinsic motivation is lacking? Well, is it lacking because they can't hear? Is it lacking because they are not motivated to do the task that we're asking? One way or another, we have to find the answer. Noise can be quite a culprit. We have hearing ranges, upper, middle, lower. The probability of a child with ADHD, you don't need a diagnosis to have ADHD, but we see the results of these kids in the gyms. They're constantly in motion, they're constantly moving, bumping into kids, and we make an assumption that it is their behavior But in fact, it's not. In fact, it's their sensory system screaming for sensory input. So these kids, while they're standing online, they're just constantly doing all this stuff, and you're saying, Johnny, get over it, kid, chill out. And that was Johnny chilled out already. So to step back and say, okay, why is this child doing what this child is doing? That's where we in the profession can get a greater handle than teachers in an academic environment. Why? Everything we have in our environment is exactly what that child wants to try and get onto. Trampolines. What is it about a trampoline that is so compelling? It is an unstable surface. Have you all seen these outdoor structures that are playground structures? They're usually concrete steel. They may have one spot on it where it's a little bit of a teeter-totter. These concrete structures get static very quickly to all children. They don't do anything. 10 minutes into it, it's like, okay, I'm done. But they'll all gravitate to that one spot where there's a little bit of an unstable surface. Trampoline is an unstable surface. Sensorily, it is providing intense vestibular input and proprioception. Both of those two are the drivers for our humanity. Unstable surfaces indicate simply stay on balance, or what? You fall. No one likes falling. Our kids, while they are enticed to the trampoline, they're also wise enough to say, I don't want to get myself hurt. So whether they're special needs or not, they're quite aware of their own bodies avoiding injury. However, you do get the ADHD kids that are, they'll find some way to racking themselves up. Okay, the idea still comes back to this. If we are providing that trampoline or tumble track or whatever version of trampolines we have, it is an intense motivator for that brain. Why? Because that child is seeking intense sensory input. Gymnastics is that intense sensory input. Swim is that intense sensory input. Going underwater, all of a sudden you don't hear anything. So for some kids, that's quite compelling. For some kids, it's just a part of what you do. But again, different sensory environments create different sensory results. If we're looking for organization, organization is that gold standard that we use in the classroom. Organization includes problem solving. Problem solving is one of the things we do in gymnastics all the time. We're given a task. How do we complete that task? If it's a handstand, we don't just do a handstand. We do all the handstand preparations and all the breakdowns to get to that handstand. And then 6-7 weeks later, we have an approximation of a handstand. But it didn't just happen. The brain had to prepare and build up its tolerance for that inversion of head below heart. That is very intimidating to a child with special needs. It can be intimidating to anybody. When was the last time many of us were doing handstands? Show off. The idea then is what we are trying to accomplish in a gymnastic environment is quite complex. We find kids that are very early great movers. We find kids very early that are not good movers. Being a good mover, particularly for children, particularly for boys, is a very personal issue. It's like a bad hair day. If you are a good mover, you got a good hair day. If you're a bad mover, no one wants you on their team, do they? Who needs you? You can't do anything. So what we try to do is find out what is the difficulty for these kids, whether it's a diagnosis or whether it's simply this is the child. ADHD we get in the gyms all across the country. ADHD is a unique diagnosis. There are predictable things about it. We know that these kids are in what we call a optimal zone of arousal. Let's see, it's that strata right here. That optimal zone of arousal is where the brain is functioning at its maximal torque. We may see a child that comes into the gym here, very low lethargy. So we get them on trampoline, we get them on swing, and we boot that optimal zone into here, where they are present, they are functioning. That optimal zone gives that child the opportunity to problem solve. And again, if they're able to problem solve in what we are doing, can they generalize that problem solving into the academic classroom? Yes. However, will they The classroom can be a very confusing environment. It's got stuff all over the walls. It's very distracting, whether it's a child with ADHD or a typical or a child with autism. The classroom is, they refer to it as the LRE, the least restrictive environment. Unfortunately for our kids, it is the most restrictive environment. It is difficult for our kids to do. The first thing that they do is come into the class and sit down. Oh God, please, anything but sitting down. Okay, right there, the child is with ADHD, he's screaming for input. And he's screaming for contact, and he's looking for something to distract him. That kid's going to have a bad day at school simply because he's in that seeking mode, constantly seeking proprioception or vestibular. Vestibular input, a function of the inner ear bilaterally, informs your brain of changes in gravity and in acceleration, deceleration, acceleration. So everything again about gymnastics is that art form of gravity, acceleration, deceleration. So how the child is able to process that immediate input and create function, well, there is a child who will succeed quickly in gymnastics or any form. That child usually has the ability to succeed academically. An interesting side note is we've done stats on former elite gymnasts. Almost all of them are 4.0 students. How is it that they're in the gym 5, 6 days a week, 4 to 5 hours a day, and they're 4.0 students? It's almost contradictory. The idea that these children have had an intense sensory bathing from 2 years old on up to 14 years old. That's 12 years of intense sensory input. That makes both sides of the hemispheres incredibly quick to process through the corpus callosum. These kids are very bright. We know that. The oddity is that the boys are equally as bright, but we work as hard as we can not to show it. Okay, how we parlay this information into that child with ADHD. Here's the point. ADHD kids, and you may have seen this, they have an interesting method of letting you know that they're there. They make a mess. They leave a stink. I use that word lovingly. The idea is that these kids need to create conflict. By the creation of conflict, they will get their brains into that optimal zone of arousal. And again, it doesn't need to be their conflict personally, but they need to find a way to get in conflict, whether it's between the teacher or a student or parent or sibling. They work to create conflict. And the moment it's there, boom, they're in that optimal zone of arousal. And then they walk away, leaving that state behind them. So when we get these kids in the gym, recognize that that's what their method is to get into that optimal zone of arousal. They don't have an agenda of, how can I bother a kid? How can I do that? That's the last thing on their mind. They're looking simply to get into that optimal zone of arousal. That's one example. Autism can have an ADHD component. Down syndrome can have an ADHD component. You could have ADHD without anything else. So it becomes very complex very quickly. What we do in our movement process is feed that sensory need. That is one of our best attributes in working with kids. That satiation takes that child who comes in like this and goes, hi, Gene. Didn't see you before. Literally, they're completely unable to attend to their environment because they're constantly seeking sensory input. That puts the burden on the instructor. How do you handle that? One kid out of 4 or 5, or maybe it's 2 kids out of 4 or 5. It gets overwhelming quickly. So, the next point of this is, are we doing the best we can as educators? Here's the point. It turns out that children with poor hearing, they have adaptive strategies, ADHD kids. Chronic and acute noise negatively affects cognitive development, and particularly long-term memory. Hold that thought. An adaptive strategy of children who are affected by chronic noise is to disregard or ignore verbal cues or speech. Johnny, come here. Johnny, Johnny! Johnny! Come here. That kid was so involved in that sensory seeking process that they didn't hear you. And the other reality is, even if they did hear you, the words just bounce off of them. Now again, is that the child overtly trying to be a pain? Hardly. The child is simply seeking to address his particular needs. That makes a burden, again, not on Johnny exclusively, but all the kids in that group, because Johnny is just sucking up all the oxygen that that one instructor is dealing with amongst 4 or 5 or 6 other kids. So it puts a lot of pressure on a coach who has no idea why Johnny's doing what Johnny's doing. So are we really sending that appropriate message? Can we get this kid to do what we need to do? Compliance? That's kind of a harder word than we want to see happen. But the idea, again, is that we've got to be very clear with what we say, what we do. Clear messages, brief messages, minimal amount of words, unlike what I'm doing right now. Say it once. Don't repeat. Don't repeat. Say it once. And find out, is the child attending? Here's a good example. We have a way of testing if the child is in working memory or active memory. And remember, working memory is based on new information, novelty. If I have a child who's doing something that I've never done before, I'll get that child to process, begin to work on that, and then in the middle of it, I'll stop. Oh, Johnny, Steve's over there. Say hi to Steve. Hi, Steve. And I won't say anything. And if Johnny gets back to what Johnny was doing without any prompting, he was in working memory. If he needs a cue, he wasn't in working memory. He was just faxing it in. So we can keep a good handle on how is this child right then and there. Are they attentive? Are they processing? Are we getting what we need from the child to move this child forward? With that, here's another interesting factoid. Okay, teachers in noisy schools, I'm glad you're all sitting down. Teachers in noisy schools are more fatigued, annoyed, and less patient. Teachers in noisy schools lose instruction time due to distractions and have a compromised teaching style. Okay, crowding as another issue. Now when we had poor Gilda up here amidst all this chaos, it was difficult to focus on what it is I was telling her. Meanwhile, I'm like two feet away and I'm screaming at her. But all of this chaos going on around. That's the point in the day where most boys live for. The playground. Give me the playground. I can deal with everything else, just give me that playground. Because it's organized chaos. One of the best things we've done in Big Fun is we go into the gyms because of the exact same point. It's organized chaos. There's groups, kids, things going on all over the place. If we are able to move this child along in the process, amidst this chaos, then we're doing our job well. If we can't, then we have to step up our game and know the why of it. Why are we not hitting this kid's mark? But the idea, again, is that we as professors, we as teachers, we as instructors, it is such a delicate operation, recognizing that at any one moment, are we attended to all the child's needs? Is the child attending to us? That schism that occurs, again, our job is to connect that child. We want coaches that are thrilling. We want instructors that dig this gig, love it. That inspires the child. That makes the parents go, this guy's great. This girl's wonderful. That is what we're providing. The environment in and of itself sells itself. The next step is, how good are our instructors? How good is our program? How well are we utilizing all of this equipment in its most functional basis? That word function is a buzzword that we use in therapy. We want to create function from the intervention. What we do in Big Fun is an intense sensory diet. Sensory diet, again, is where you've seen us with the swings. The swings, there are 2 types of vestibular input. One is linear, and one is rotation. Gymnastics is rotation. Forward rolls, cartwheels, everything on every piece of equipment we are learning how to rotate, spin. If a child is learning these tools, regardless of the technique, What does that sensory input do to their brain? Rotation, boom. You are spinning in a 360 circle. That fires up the brain. If you do enough of this, that kid begins to get into that optimal zone of arousal or above it. Then we may have a problem. So it becomes, again, fine-tuning on how much of this input does the child need or how much can the child take. If we are able, we're pretty good at grading and judging where that end is. You're done on swing. The two types of vestibular inputs, linear and rotation. Linear is calming to the nervous system. You ride a bicycle, straight. You can check out. You don't need to think about it. You can just pedal. You're on a swing. You don't need to think about it. You just check out and you enjoy the linear motion. Rotation, excitatory. So when you're doing movement on that tumble track where you're doing trick to trick to trick to trick, by the time you're done, you're lit up like a candle. You should be. Hence, we are providing our students with an intense process to create function. The function is, how well do they do what we need them to do? The details. The details. One of the most difficult thing with, certainly with special need kids, is they basically blow off the details. They give you an approximation of what it is. What we do in Big Fun is we don't let them off the hook. I want the details. The point is this. In a classroom environment, that child with autism has to be responsible for the details as well as any other child. Why would I let that kid off in my environment from the details that everyone else has to accomplish? We don't. So the details, the position of the hands, the pointing toes, the turnout at the hips, whatever it is we're focusing on, it is the details that we have to see, are they connecting to that brain? If not, we have to go back. If we miss it, we're not going to get it because the child will have reinforced and incorrect posture through repetition, active memory. Okay. Again, the next thing, as I mentioned here, we find that in places where it's intensely noisy, intensely crowded, according to these stats, these kids have a difficulty in learning, in retaining information, cognition, tweezing out what is important and focusing in on that amidst all this other information. Okay. What I have recognized is this. I've never been in a gym except when it's empty, where it is not chaos, loud, crowded. Yet, our kids learn. Our kids learn every day, every hour, amidst this chaos, this noise, this overcrowding. How is it that according to the stats, it shouldn't be working that way? Yet, we in the profession of gymnastics, in the profession of swim, we seem to manage to get around that particular issue. What is it about these environments that in fact drives the capacity to open that working memory window and let information come in? What is it that we do? Do we talk to them differently? Probably not. Are we doing something different that isn't available anywhere else? Probably yes. The environment that we operate in is intensely sensory. It isn't intensely sensory just for special need kids. It is for all human beings. And the response that our kids in Big Fun give are the exact same response that the neurotypical brain provides. The difference is that you can say to the typical kid, sit down, and they sit down. That's great. Come over here, and they do that. That's great. With our kids, we've got to find another way, another vocabulary that gets the point across. But for the rest of us, that's not the issue. The issue is, what is it about that we do that makes these kids, like all of those former athletes, high achievers? My thinking has always been it is the invocation of this intense sensory diet from very young pediatric ages to a fairly mature teenager. That amount of sensory information has created incredible function in how that brain is able to interpret and tweeze out unnecessary information to create a functional response. That is what we do in gymnastics. We problem solve all the time. We sequence all the time. We initiate all the time. We use language. We have to have memory. We have to regard impulsivity, distractibility, and disorganization and recognize that these are byproducts of all brains, all people. So, what we are doing right now clearly jumps the track based on what the academics are looking at. How do these kids learn better? Well, in our environments, they seem to be doing fine. What I would like to see in a long-term projection would be the gymnastic profession takes on its own sense of research to understand how, on a developmental process, gymnastics, swim, creates an adaptive brain that is able to function at a quicker, higher velocity. If we had been able, years ago, to start mapping this out, we might be able to sit in a different situation where each of our clubs that we come from, we go to the local school districts and say, bring your kids to us. Rather than, we're here, you're welcome to come in anytime you want. Far from it. Create within your local community a user-friendly, constant use of these kids coming into your facility and giving them what their brains are screaming for. Watch the results. Start marking these results. Do we have something that gives research a good places to stand? Once that occurs, then we go knock on the federal government's doors for grants and start saying, hello, we have something to say. Any thoughts so far? Come on. Yeah.
I think that's true that all gymnasts are smart, and I don't know anybody who didn't finish college from my long years. My old friends are very successful, but I think it's natural selection. The kids who cannot do gymnastics, who play soccer, football, baseball, blah, blah, blah. So it is not for all kids. I mean, gymnastics is kind of selection, and smart kids stay in gymnastics.
Did you all hear the point? It's a great point. What is your name?
Rada, Rada,
Watch me.
Rada.
Grada?
R.
Rada. Wow, that was fun. Rada says that she thinks the issue of natural selection creates the gymnast in the long term. Yeah, thank you. You know, in truth, I have to agree with you that natural selection does. I had a conversation with Caroli a couple of years ago, and what I was holding the line on was the child that is a natural twister. That is the child that we should pick out immediately and put into that kind of super elite grouping. The reason is kids that can twist at an early age are able to interpret movement and use that interpretation outside of the box. The kids that have difficulty with rotation, with twist, they're the kids that, just as you say, not every child in America is meant to be a gymnast. It's like not every child is meant to be a doctor. We have too many doctors. The idea here is exactly that gymnastics, in my opinion, is possibly the best movement form for preschool and into middle school maybe. But at that point, the information and the rehearsal of the process has been given. And the child can then go into other places of interest, soccer, baseball, whatever it is, but they've been given a great foundation, sensorially, motorically, organizationally. So we basically just kind of tipped the iceberg on what we're capable of doing. My position, again, is I wish to push that as far forward as possible. I got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to remind that the audience is this. I have 4 minutes left. Thank you. That what I have found in the last few years is that working in special needs has like a stone in the pond, it trickles outward. So what I found is that coaches were coming up to me wherever I was going in the gym that I was at saying, I want to come on board with you. I want to do this because it looks like something I want to jump into. Great. Ultimately, we took a lot of coaches and we started training them in Big Fun Method. What I've now done is recognize that it's a way bigger thing than I had ever perceived. So we're doing certification. Big Fun is the only organization in the United States that I'm aware of that has a certification for therapists and coaches to work with children with special needs in the gymnastic environment. Knowing what the environment is one aspect. Knowing what the child's limits are, another aspect. But what we need to know, and this also isn't exclusive to children with special needs, to have this type of background and information makes your typical coaches working with typical kids that much sharper. They understand the why of things. So what we look at is creating a certification program for the coaches, the therapists. They bring it back to their gym. Their gym is then Big Fun certified. So what then happens is the local community, and again, as I say, the word of mouth kind of sporadic, but in truth, the special needs population and community, word of mouth is all of it. Because these parents travel in packs. They go from school in a pack to the therapy in a pack. They go from therapy to this in a pack. So if something good is in their community, they find out about it. So my role now is I work certifications and I do a lot of lecturing. With that in mind, if anyone's interested, I have a table back there. Lynn, can you raise your hand? Somewhere around there is my table, and there's Lynn, thank you. If anyone wants any information on the certification, it's there. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.